I found out why my wife takes such good care of me after the crash. The insurance papers changed everything. I wish you had just let go, she whispered when she thought I was sleeping. The impact erased itself from my memory. One moment, I was driving home, the road slick with rain, the world outside blurred by the downpour. The next, I was waking up in a hospital bed, my body wrapped in bandages, pain radiating from every limb. The doctors called it a miracle. My car had veered off the road, flipped twice, and landed upside down in a ditch. The emergency responders had expected to pull out a body. Instead, they found me, broken, but alive. They told me I was lucky. Lying in that hospital bed, I didn't feel lucky. I felt wrong, off-kilter, like I had fallen into someone else's life by mistake. The pain in my body was nothing compared to the heaviness in my chest, an unease that had nothing to do with my injuries. Claire sat beside me, her hands resting lightly on mine, her face carefully composed. She looked like a woman who had nearly lost everything. Her eyes shone with unshed tears, her grip just a little too tight. She exhaled shakily when the doctors said I would make a full recovery, as if she had been holding her breath for days. I tried to tell myself it was normal. She was my wife. Of course she was emotional. Anyone would be if they had almost lost their husband. But there was something else. A flicker of something in her expression, too fast to name. A tension in her body, not quite grief, not quite relief. Her voice, steady, but too careful. I ignored it at first, blaming it on the medication, the trauma, the exhaustion. But 2 days later, when I was finally strong enough to move, I found the paperwork. It was buried under a stack of hospital forms, tucked away like an afterthought. My name was there. My birth date. A signature that was supposed to be mine but wasn't. And beneath it, the details of a life insurance policy I had never agreed to, one that had been taken out months before. The payout was massive, enough to change someone's life completely. Claire's name was listed as the sole beneficiary. And just like that, the unease in my chest turned into something cold, something sharp. I wasn't lucky to be alive. I wasn't supposed to survive. The paper felt heavier than it should have, the edges curling slightly under the weight of my grip. The numbers stared back at me, unyielding, undeniable. A life insurance policy I had never signed. A policy worth more money than I had ever seen in my life. It had been filed months ago, long before the accident. The company name was unfamiliar, but the signatures and dates were clear. My name, written in black ink, perfectly neat. Too neat. It wasn't mine. Claire's name stood out beneath mine, the sole beneficiary. My pulse pounded in my ears, the steady beep of the hospital monitor tracking the quickening of my heart. I forced myself to take slow breaths, to stay rational, to think. People take out life insurance all the time. Spouses plan for the worst. It was responsible, logical. But this was too much money, and I had never been told. I flipped through the pages, scanning every line. The fine print blurred in my vision, but the details weren't what mattered. The timing was. A policy that large, that carefully structured, wasn't taken out on a whim. Someone had planned it. Someone had considered, calculated, ensured that if I died, Claire would never have to worry about money again. Except I hadn't died. The accident, the so-called miracle, the way the car had gone off the road, flipping so cleanly, landing just right, just wrong, enough to make survival unlikely. I tried to shake the thought away. Coincidences happened. Accidents happened. But Claire had been acting strange since the moment I woke up. Too relieved, too careful. Had she known about this policy? Of course she had. Her name was on it. I pressed my fingers against my temples, the headache worsening. My body still ached from the crash, but this was different. This was something deeper, a sickness twisting in my gut, something I couldn't name. I shoved the papers back into the folder, tucking it beneath the blankets just as the door opened. Claire entered, carrying a cup of coffee, steam curling into the air. She smiled when she saw me awake, but the expression was off, too controlled, too measured. I watched her carefully, waiting for my stomach to settle, waiting for my heartbeat to slow. It didn't, because now, I wasn't sure if I was lying in this hospital bed recovering from an accident, or if I was lying next to someone who had been waiting for me to die. The papers remained hidden beneath the blankets, their presence a quiet weight pressing against my mind. I had spent the rest of the afternoon staring at the ceiling, my thoughts tangled and fraying at the edges. The accident had already felt too surreal, too perfectly catastrophic. But now, with the insurance policy looming over it, the details began to shift into something uglier. I forced myself to think rationally. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe Claire had taken out the policy as a precaution and simply never mentioned it. But if that were true, why the secrecy? Why the sheer size of it? A payout that large wasn't standard. It was the kind of policy that assumed something inevitable. And then there was the accident itself. The memory remained just out of reach, blurred at the edges. I had been driving home. It had been raining. The road was slick. Then suddenly, I lost control. That was all I could recall, nothing more. But the more I tried to piece it together, the more the gaps felt intentional, as if my mind was shielding me from something I wasn't ready to see. Claire had been by my side since I woke up, her presence unwavering. She smoothed my blankets, adjusted my pillows, refilled my water. But now, every action felt rehearsed, like a performance perfected over time. She never once mentioned the insurance policy. Had she expected me not to find it? Or worse, had she assumed I wouldn't be alive to? The thought chilled me. I needed answers. But more than that, I needed to be careful. If I confronted Claire too soon, I risked tipping my hand. If my paranoia was misplaced, I would sound unhinged. If it wasn't, if my suspicions were right, I wasn't ready for that yet. I had to start small. I needed to confirm what I already knew and look for what I didn't. I needed to retrace the accident, find out exactly what had happened that night. And I needed to do it without Claire knowing. Because now, I was no longer just recovering. I was investigating. The hospital felt claustrophobic, the sterile white walls pressing in from all sides. I was exhausted, but not from the pain or the medication. It was the weight of what I had found. The insurance policy, the sheer amount of money Claire stood to gain, the accident that had almost been fatal. Almost. The fact should have reassured me. I had survived. I was recovering. Claire had been by my side, tending to me with steady hands and whispered reassurances. But none of it felt real anymore. The warmth of her touch now felt calculated. The way she smoothed my blankets, refilled my water, stayed close. None of it eased the unease sitting in my chest. I wasn't supposed to wake up. I knew it now, deep in my bones. But knowing it and proving it were two different things. And if Claire truly was responsible, if she had planned for me to die, she was already steps ahead of me. If I made one wrong move, she would know. I couldn't afford that. I needed someone else to look into it. Someone who could see things from the outside, without the weight of paranoia clouding their judgment. The thought came fast, fully formed. A solution so simple it unsettled me that I hadn't considered it sooner. I needed a private investigator. Someone trained to see what I was missing. I couldn't use my phone in the hospital. Claire would check my search history, my call logs, anything that seemed unusual. I needed to be careful. But there was a way. The nurse on duty was young, polite, always moving in and out of the room to check my vitals. I had overheard her talking to another nurse earlier about her long shift, how exhausted she was. She would be easy to ask for a favor. When she came in to adjust my I told her I had a work emergency. My phone had been damaged in the crash, and I needed to make an urgent call. She hesitated for only a moment before handing me the hospital landline. I kept my voice level as I dialed. The number belonged to an old college friend, Ryan. We hadn't spoken in years, but I knew he worked in security and occasionally did investigative work. He had always been good at digging up information people wanted buried. When he answered, I kept the conversation vague. I told him I needed a favor, something personal, and that I would pay well. He didn't ask questions, just told me he would handle it. That was all I needed. I hung up, handing the phone back to the nurse with a grateful nod. Now, all I had to do was wait. Because if there was something to find, if Claire had played a role in this, Ryan would uncover it. And then, I would know for sure if the woman sitting at my bedside was waiting for me to get better, or waiting for me to die. Lying in the hospital bed, I forced myself to breathe evenly, to keep my expression neutral. Every moment stretched too long. Every small noise from the hallway made my pulse spike. I had done what I needed to do. Now, all I could do was wait. Ryan had always been discreet. He wouldn't call back immediately, not if he was already looking into it. He would move carefully, gathering what he could without leaving a trail. That was why I had chosen him. But waiting left too much time for my mind to spiral. Claire returned not long after I had made the call. She was carrying a bag of takeout, her face set in soft concern. She moved around the room with practiced ease, arranging things neatly, adjusting my blanket as if I were fragile. It would have seemed like love before. Now, I wasn't sure what it was. She sat beside me, her fingers grazing my wrist absently. The touch felt wrong. Too familiar, too knowing. She started talking about the recovery process, about the physical therapy I would need, about how we would get through this together. I listened, nodding in the right places, forcing myself to keep my breathing steady. The words were comforting. The way she spoke, the way she framed everything as it was perfect. Too perfect. It felt like something rehearsed. I thought about the insurance policy, about how she had never mentioned it, about how, if I had died that night, she would have had everything: money, sympathy, a fresh start. I tried to push the thought down. If I let paranoia take over, I would slip up. She would notice. But something was already changing. Claire had been so steady since the moment I woke up. Always calm, always composed. But tonight, there was a shift. Her hand twitched slightly as she adjusted my blanket. Her voice wavered for just a second when she told me she would handle all the hospital paperwork. She was nervous. I had spent years with this woman. I knew her inside and out. And Claire never got nervous. She wasn't afraid for me. She was afraid of something else. That was when I realized. She already knew I had seen something I wasn't supposed to, and she was waiting for me to make my move. Claire stayed by my side the entire time. She never pushed, never pried, but I could feel it. She was watching me, waiting for something. I didn't know what exactly, but I knew it wasn't good. Then, she slipped. I wasn't fully asleep when she muttered it under her breath. "I wish you had just let go." It was quiet, almost like she was talking to herself. If I hadn't been pretending to sleep, I might have missed it. I felt my stomach drop. That was it. That was the confirmation I had been trying to ignore. She wanted me dead. I had no reaction, didn't flinch, didn't move, just let my body stay as still as possible while my mind spun. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. It had slipped. But people don't say things like that unless they've already thought them 1,000 times before. She left not long after, probably assuming I was too out of it to hear. The second she was gone, I forced myself to breathe through the pain and reached for my phone. I had to be careful. Claire had been handling most of my things since the accident, and I wouldn't put it past her to check my call logs. But I needed to know what Ryan had found. No messages. No calls. I stared at the screen, waiting, willing it to light up. He had never taken this long to get back to me before. Something was wrong. I wasn't safe. Not here. Not with her. And if I didn't act fast, I wasn't sure I would get another chance. Ryan should have called by now. I knew him. He didn't waste time, especially not on jobs like this. I checked my phone again. No messages. No calls. Nothing. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe he was still looking into it. Maybe he had hit a dead end. But I had a feeling in my gut that told me this wasn't just a delay. I sent him a short email. Need an update. Urgent. No response. Then I called. It rang twice before going straight to voicemail. I hung up and tried again. Same thing. Ryan was either ignoring me, or he couldn't answer. That's when I felt it, the creeping certainty that this wasn't just paranoia anymore. Claire had been acting strange since I woke up, like she was walking on a tightrope, waiting for the wrong moment to fall. She knew I was alive when I wasn't supposed to be. If she had figured out I was asking questions, she would have acted. I didn't know how much she knew, but if Ryan had found something, if he had confronted the wrong person, then he might not be in a position to help me anymore. That meant I was on my own. I pressed the call button, waited for the nurse, and told her I wanted to start the discharge process. She hesitated, saying I needed clearance from the doctor. I nodded, playing along. I already knew what would happen next. Claire would find out. And the moment she did, I wouldn't have much time. I needed a way out before she made sure I never left this hospital at all. The nurse left to get the doctor, and I knew I had minutes at best. Claire had insisted on being involved in every decision about my care. If the hospital tried to call her, she would come running. I couldn't let that happen. I pushed myself up, pain radiating through my ribs, but I gritted my teeth and forced my legs over the side of the bed. My clothes were in the drawer next to me. I grabbed them, moving fast, every second counting. By the time the doctor arrived, I was already dressed. He looked surprised but recovered quickly, flipping through my chart. He started saying something about needing more time to monitor my concussion, but I cut him off. I told him I was leaving, that I'd sign whatever paperwork was necessary. He hesitated but didn't argue. Hospitals didn't hold people against their will unless they were a danger to themselves. And I wasn't, at least, not in the way they thought. The discharge took longer than I wanted. I kept checking my phone, expecting Claire to call, to show up. Every second felt like a countdown to something I couldn't see. Finally, They wheeled me to the entrance. A nurse offered to call someone to pick me up. I shook my head, said I had a ride. I didn't, but I couldn't risk anyone knowing where I was going. I stepped outside into the cold air, my heart pounding. I needed to think. I needed a plan. Ryan was gone. Claire was watching, and I was alone. Then my phone buzzed. A single message from an unknown number. Stop asking questions. My stomach twisted. Someone knew. And they weren't just warning me. They were making sure I understood. If I didn't stop now, I wouldn't get another chance. I looked up, scanning the street. Everything felt normal, but it wasn't. A black sedan was parked across the lot, the engine running. Too ordinary, too still. My pulse hammered in my ears as I turned away and started walking, keeping my pace even. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to move. I didn't have a plan, no money, no car. Claire had been handling everything since the accident. I had nothing except the clothes on my back and my phone, and I had no idea who was watching me. You're absolutely right. There needs to be a smoother transition between Part 8 and Part 9. Here's the revised version, keeping it realistic and making sure every step follows logically. The moment my phone buzzed with the unknown number's message, I knew I had a serious problem. This is your last warning. This wasn't a vague threat. Someone knew exactly where I was. They had been tracking me since I left the hospital. I forced myself to stay calm. Running blindly wouldn't help. My options were limited. I had no credit cards, no car, barely any cash. I couldn't go home. Claire would be waiting. The hospital was out of the question. I needed to get off the street. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere I could think. I spotted a cheap motel down the block, the kind of place where no one asked questions as long as you paid in cash. I walked in, keeping my head down, and slid the last of my bills across the counter. The clerk barely looked at me as he handed over the key. Room 14. I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the bed. My whole body ached, but I couldn't rest. My mind kept racing through everything that had happened. The accident, the insurance policy, Ryan going silent, and now this. Ryan had found something. I was sure of it. And now, I couldn't reach him. I grabbed the motel phone and dialed the only number I had left. David. My brother and I hadn't spoken in over a year. The last time we talked, he warned me about Claire, told me there was something off about her. I had laughed it off, told him he was being paranoid. Now I was calling him, hiding in a motel room, terrified that my wife had just tried to kill me. The phone rang once, twice. Then he picked up. I didn't waste time explaining. I told him I was in trouble, that I needed help, that Claire had done something, was doing something. A long silence. Then, finally, his voice. Where are you? I gave him the motel name. He didn't ask anything else, just said he was coming. I hung up and let out a shaky breath. Help was on the way. But something told me I wouldn't have much time before Claire made her next move. The knock on my door came just after 5 a.m. 3 quick taps, David's old habit. I unlocked it fast, pulling him inside. He looked the same, worn-down jacket, dark circles under his eyes. But his expression changed the second he saw me. I must have looked worse than I thought. He sat down, exhaling. Tell me everything. I told him. The accident, the insurance policy, the missing investigator, the messages. The way Claire had never expected me to wake up. The way someone had just been outside my door. David listened, barely blinking. When I finished, he sat back, rubbing a hand down his face. Jesus. I expected him to tell me I was wrong, that I was imagining things. But he didn't. Instead, he pulled out his phone and opened a tab. A news article. My stomach dropped. It was about Ryan. A car fire. The driver's body unidentifiable. Authorities suspected an accident. But we both knew better. You think Claire. I couldn't even finish the sentence. David nodded. She's covering her tracks. Everything felt like it was crashing down on me at once. I had spent years thinking I was in a happy, stable marriage. Now I was sitting in a motel room, hiding from the woman I had shared a life with, knowing she had been planning my death like a financial transaction. It's worse than that, David continued. I ran some searches before I got here. Claire has already started moving money. She's been shifting funds between different accounts, liquidating assets. She's preparing for something. I swallowed hard. She was preparing for a life without me. David pulled out another folder and tossed it onto the table between us. I hesitated before flipping it open. Inside were bank records, emails, a second life insurance policy, this one forged. I scanned the documents, my pulse hammering. Claire had been planning this for months. The first policy had been legal, but this second one? This one was dirty. It was filed under an alias, with falsified medical records. If I had died in the crash, she wouldn't have just walked away with the massive payout. She would have been paid twice. My hands clenched into fists. She wasn't just looking for security. She had been gambling on my death, doubling her profits. And Ryan? Ryan had found this. And now he was dead. I felt sick. David's voice cut through my thoughts. We have to assume she knows you're onto her. I barely heard him. My mind was spiraling, looping through every moment of the last few months, searching for something, anything, that would have warned me. Had she been waiting for the right moment? Had she looked at me across the dinner table, knowing I was a paycheck waiting to be cashed? I thought back to the night of the accident. Had she been the one to tamper with my car? Had she known the rain would make the road slick enough to make it seem like an accident? David leaned forward. Listen to me. You need to disappear. I looked at him, my mind still catching up. Disappear? He wasn't talking about a hotel or a short-term escape. He meant for good. A new life. A new name. No paper trail. I wanted to argue, but what choice did I have? If Claire had planned my death once, she could do it again. And next time, I might not survive. My hands shook as I ran them through my hair. I can't believe this is happening. David didn't sugarcoat it. It is. And if you don't make a move now, she'll make it for you. He was right. I had spent days looking for proof, trying to find a way to make sense of it all. But what was I going to do? Call the police? Tell them my wife had secretly taken out multiple insurance policies, and that I had a feeling she had tried to kill me? They'd call Claire. She'd cry. She'd play the role of the devastated wife, the one trying to take care of her injured husband. And I'd be the paranoid man with a head injury, grasping at conspiracy theories. No one would believe me. And by the time they started asking the right questions, I would already be dead. I clenched my jaw and nodded. David stood up. We leave now. I didn't look back as I walked out of the motel room. By the time Claire realized I was missing, I would be long gone, and she would never find me.